have spent a lot of time discussing various business plans for social ventures. But unless you have funding, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish your venture's goals. In this video, we aim to answer the following questions. Where can you get funding for your venture? And what obligations come with that funding? There are 4 different types of funding that we will be discussing: contracts, grants, debt, and equity. Each type of funding comes from a different source and is available at different stages of your venture's development. Some types of funding are available for ventures that are just starting out, while others are reserved for well-established ventures that have already started making a profit and have assets. Let's first consider some pros and cons of each of the 4 types of funding. One of the benefits of contracts is that there is no dilution of equity. In other words, as the venture's founder, you don't have to give up any ownership of your venture when you sign a contract. On the other hand, contracts are highly competitive, and when you sign the contract, you may be subject to performance milestones. Oftentimes, when people give you funding for a project, they want to ensure that their money is being put to good use and that you are making progress and not wasting their funds. Many people think of grants as free money. When your venture receives funding from a grant, they have no obligation to repay that money. There is no interest charged, and you don't have to give up any equity. Also, there are many organizations that fund social ventures, so there are many different types of grants available from a variety of organizations. There are 2 popular government programs that give grants to high-tech companies: the SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Program, and STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer. There are also numerous private organizations, foundations, and other government organizations that provide funds to technology entrepreneurs. Let's now look at a specific example of government funding. The Corporation for National and Community Service is a federal agency that engages more than 5 million Americans in service through various programs, such as Senior Corps, AmeriCorps, and the Social Innovation Fund. The Social Innovation Fund is a program intended to improve the lives of people in low-income communities by combining public and private resources to grow promising community-based solutions. The Social Innovation Fund awards grants to experienced grant-making intermediaries that understand the community very well so that they can help guide the money to promising programs and have a stronger and more successful impact. An example of a grant-making intermediary that SIF has awarded funding to is AIDS United. AIDS United supports innovative strategies that will increase access to care and improve health outcomes for at least 3,500 low-income individuals living with HIV or AIDS. The SIF awarded AIDS United $2.1 million annually for 2 years. AIDS United then distributed this funding to partnering organizations, and in total, this SIF grant supported 10 innovative AIDS United partnerships. While grants are essentially free money, they also have their drawbacks. Sometimes, grants may not be for what you ultimately want to do. Also, with grants, like contracts, you may be subject to performance milestones, as well as strict reporting requirements. Many ventures actually start out with the founder's own money. This often means going into debt. Debt can mean borrowing from friends, family, or banks, taking out a second mortgage, or maxing out credit cards. Founders often go into debt with the intention of being able to pay all of the money back, with interest, in the future. It takes a large amount of faith in your technology and business because going into debt can be extremely risky. You could end up losing your house or making enemies out of friends if you can't repay them on time, or worse, not at all. Some of the pros of funding a venture by going into debt is that it's generally easy to find sources that will loan you money, and it's a well-established industry. Debt is more difficult for pre-revenue companies because lenders are not always sure that the venture will succeed and their money will be repaid. The final type of funding we will discuss is equity. Equity financing is the purchase of shares of stock in return for money invested in the company. When an investor is given a percentage share of the venture in exchange for their investment, they are taking a risk. There is the possibility that they will be able to exit the venture with high returns. However, there's also the possibility that they could walk away with nothing. Private equity is when a few individual investors, venture capitalists, angels, and other sophisticated investors, are given a percentage share of the venture in exchange for their investment. They're usually looking for fast, high returns, and their goal is to exit as soon as they've made a lot of money. There are usually only a few private investors in one venture. They can't trade their ownership easily, compared to public equity. Some of the pros of private equity are that there is no repayment until exit, investors usually have similar interests to that of the venture, and this type of funding is possible for early-stage firms. As is true with all forms of equity funding, you will have to give up ownership of part of your venture, and at some point you will be required to exit. Venture founders lose a measure of control, and investors often have a say over his or her salary. Public equity is when the company's ownership is traded freely on the open market. There can be thousands of investors, and they can each own very small units of the company. Investors can buy and sell shares very easily. One of the issues with public equity is that markets can be very volatile, and stock prices can fluctuate wildly based on information moving through the marketplace. Public equity results in liquidity for investors and other shareholders, and there is long-term business viability. Unfortunately, public equity is not available to early-stage firms. It's often very expensive to access, and there are stringent reporting requirements. Now that we have discussed the pros and cons of the 4 different types of funding, we want to go over the sources of this funding. Where do you find contracts and grants? Who will be willing to lend you money? And who will be the investors willing to take the risk of owning part of your venture? The following is a list of a few sources of funding. Friends, family, and fools, banks, venture capitalists, strategic investors, angels, the public, and the government are all groups we will be discussing. Before we look at the different sources of funding, it's important to know that these sources are not available to all ventures. It depends where in the venture life cycle you are. Let's see where in the venture life cycle different sources of funding are available. The horizontal axis shows the various venture life cycle stages, all the way from just an idea up to being a profitable venture. The more developed your venture is, the less risk investors are taking because there's less uncertainty. The vertical axis represents the different stages of venture funding. As you move up the axis, the return on investor investments decreases. Friends, family, and fools, government organizations, and angel investors are all willing to invest in early-stage ventures. Strategic partners are willing to invest at a variety of stages, and venture capitalists tend to invest later in the venture's life, before they have become extremely profitable, because venture capitalists are looking to get a high return out of their investments. While venture capitalists invest later in a venture's life cycle than angels or friends, family, and fools, venture capitalists still invest early on in the venture's life cycle compared to public equity. Banks are less willing to take risks because they want to ensure that the venture will be profitable in order to pay back their loans. Finally, IPOs are reserved for ventures that are well developed and profitable. They are not available for early-stage ventures. Let's now take a closer look at each one of these sources of funding. The first source of funding we are going to consider is funding from friends, family, and fools. This funding is generally early stage and tends to be in relatively small amounts. The funding is generally invested out of friendship and the desire to lend a hand. Friends and family are usually unable to help the founder with advice and mentoring, customer or other contacts, and recruiting. Funding for a social venture can also come from banks. Bank loans are rarely a source of capital until a company actually has revenue and profits, or at least a significant physical asset that could be used as collateral for a loan. Funding for social ventures can also come from venture capitalists. Venture capital is a form of financing for a company in which the business gives up some level of ownership and control in exchange for capital over a limited time frame. Venture capitalists fund a very small percentage of startup companies. Venture capitalists are looking for a large and rapidly expanding market, people in management that can get the job done, a unique and defensible technology idea that can be commercialized, a strategy that has a strong sustainable competitive advantage, and a reasonable price per share when looking to invest their money. Many new ventures form partnerships with larger companies. The larger company may make an equity investment, which is usually between 5 or 20% of the company. The partnership may sometimes involve a license, or the large company may only wish to have a window on the technology and an option to license it or buy the company if things go well. Partnership money is usually invested after you've developed a proof of concept or prototype, but sometimes the partner will produce or pay for the prototype itself. Angel investors are individuals who back emerging entrepreneurial ventures. Typically, angel investors are high net worth individuals who often invest for both fun and for profit. Angels usually invest between $25,000 up to $100,000 to $200,000. There are also angel groups, which consist of professionally managed angels banded together. Angel groups may invest up to $1 or $2 million. Interestingly, angel investors now provide about 90% of the seed and early stage funding outside equity capital for startup entrepreneurs. Let's now look at a real-life example of an angel group. Investor Circle is a network of 150 angel investors, venture capitalists, foundations, and family offices that are using private capital to promote the transition to a sustainable economy. Investor Circle's mission is to increase the flow of capital to early-stage companies that support organic agriculture and sustainable forestry. Investor Circle also focuses on supporting minority and women entrepreneurs. Members of Investor Circle include high net worth individuals, family office managers, venture capitalists, foundation officers, as well as investment advisors. These members pay an annual fee to be a member of Investor Circle. The investors are then able to communicate and work together to invest in early-stage companies. Since 1992, Investor Circle has facilitated the flow of over $134 million into more than 200 private companies and small venture funds, focusing on energy and the environment, food and organics, health and wellness, media and education, and community development. An initial public offering, or IPO, is a liquidity event. This is where investors have the opportunity to get their money out, hopefully with a significant gain. IPOs do not provide funds early in the life of the venture, and normally they only make sense after the company has a history of real revenues and profits. When a company goes public, it offers shares in the company for sale on the open market through an exchange such as the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. There, the general public can purchase ownership in the company. This means the company must now act in the best interests of its shareholders and will be more carefully regulated. This is an important consideration for any company thinking about doing an IPO. The last source of funding we are going to consider is funding from the state or federal governments. The state and federal governments have many different organizations that provide funding to entrepreneurial ventures. This is something that many ventures should look into when figuring out where they are going to get their funds from. You have now seen 4 different types of funding, as well as various sources of that funding. There is truly a galaxy of funding resources available for entrepreneurial ventures, including social entrepreneurial ventures. Clearly, there is a lot to keep in mind when deciding what will be the best way for you to fund your own ventures. Think about the various pros and cons of each, and consider the entire system when choosing where you will get your funds from.